Start?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Obviously, this week is Rosh Hashana, and one of the questions that I always ask, I always try to think of different answers, but sometimes the different answers are really based on the same idea. And I think that perhaps today that the same will be a different answer, but it will probably be based to some degree on the same idea. All right, the question is, what is the connection between the creation of man and Rosh Hashana? The creation of man, which is the historical basis, I guess, for Rosh Hashana, and the idea of Rosh Hashana being a Yom Tshuva, as being the first of the 10 days of repentance. What is the connection between the two? And it's very there is a very interesting medrash, and not every opinion in the medrash agrees with this, but it's the opinion of Rav Avohu. And Rav Avohu says that the Torah tells us in Bereshis that the world before creation, or at the very time of creation, at the very beginning of creation, was tohu vavohu. And Rabbi Avohu seems to be of the opinion that the world was created from tohu vavohu. The Ramban has a whole explanation what tohu vavohu is. But Rabbi Avohu's opinion, it's an opinion that's discussed extensively by the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim, although he seems to reject that opinion, is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Boneh, olamos, umachrivan. That God, before creating this world, created other worlds. But those worlds did not find favor in his eyes, figuratively. And because of that, he destroyed those worlds. And the way the Mekubalim, who all use this opinion of Rabbi Avohu, the way they explain it is that the worlds that God creates are really kalim, are utensils for God's presence or God's emanations. And when God withdraws from these utensils, from these vessels, from these kalim, then these kalim, they crumble and they disappear. And it was this is the way the mystical scholars, the Mekubalim, explain the idea of God creating borei olamos umachrivan. God, by withdrawing from these worlds, he caused these worlds to be destroyed. But he used, according to Rabbi Avohu, some aspects of these worlds to create the present world that we live in. And there are all kinds of understandings to what degree God used the previous worlds. The Tiferes Yisrael seems to have an explanation that those worlds were used extensively in the creation of this world. And he attributes many of the archaeological discoveries to perhaps these former worlds. But we have to understand, and my uncle raises this question, when a person plans to build a house, and he makes plans, and sometimes he begins to build a house, but he sees something wrong with it. So he destroys what he created or what he built because it doesn't find favor in his eyes. But God knows all. The person who built the house did not realize when he started building the house that he would have these problems. That's why he built the house. And that's why he was forced to destroy them. But God, who knows everything, why should he build worlds that he knew would not find favor in his eyes? And my uncle says an amazing thought. He says, there is a mitzvah in the Torah of a halachta b'drachav. We have to follow the path of God these days and days of slichas. And we say, Rachum Chanun Erech Hapayim. We talk about the traits of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as they're perceived by us. A God being merciful. It's all based on the idea that we have to, in a sense, use God and what God does and the way God acts as a blueprint for how we should act. And to a certain degree, that could be attributed, I think, to the fact that we are partners of God. God wanted man to be his partner. Asher bara Elokim, as I mentioned many times, especially recently, Asher bara Elokim la'asos. God wanted man to be a partner of his. And God realized that time and time, man initiates plans. And sometimes they're noble plans. And sometimes those plans are destroyed, come to an end. Perhaps not by the choice of the person who initiated the plans. And sometimes the person realizes that this won't work. And he feels a necessity to destroy. In a sense, in doing that, if he's motivated by the right ideas and the right ideals, then he is following the path of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu built worlds and destroyed them to serve as a lesson for man. And the lesson for man is that sometimes we will not succeed. We will see that we are not succeeding, or we will be prevented from succeeding. But we should not give up hope. And all that is part of the halachta b'drachav, of becoming a partner of God. And there are many examples of becoming a partner of God. One example is the mitzvah pruvu. There is joining God as a creator. God created man, and man creates man. Man becomes a partner of God in the creation of man. Another example, and that's an example my uncle says, is where we see something being destroyed or something is going wrong. So in becoming a partner of God, we have to try to fix it. And an example is the mitzvah of V'rapo Yirape. When there is sickness, we have to alleviate the sickness. We have to cause cures. We have to prevent the sickness. Right now, unfortunately, there are foolish people And they sometimes speak in the name of the Torah, which besides everything else is a chutzpah. And they talk against preventing COVID. And while they would have been wrong when the illness first attacked us, attacked the world, attacked our community, caused many deaths among Rabbanim, Dolim, Jews of all kinds, all of mankind. You would think they would learn their lesson. But instead of helping to fix the world, they have become part of the destructive nature. And this is going against the idea of the halachta b'drachav. Now, and of course, someone suggested to me that I should mention, if I discuss about COVID, there are all kinds of conditions that a person has that makes the effect of COVID even worse. So from the perspective of halachta b'drachav, of preserving life, of giving the ability to those who are sick to be cured, to restore health. So the person, there are conditions, person has to watch their own health. And while that's always true, in these days it's more true than ever before. We know Aseres Yemei Tshuva, Ram says, Alpha P, that Tshuva is Yafa whenever you do it. But in Aseres Yemei Tshuva, it's Yafa B'yoser. Watching over one's health is Yafa B'yoser in these days when the health of the world is being challenged. Now, and there are examples. Rabbi Akiva, the Gemara in Yevamos mentions, Rabbi Akiva had 24,000 students. He was an elderly man at the time who was already being chased by the Romans. And all 24,000 students died. Different theories, whether it's Askara or something else. The Shita and the Gonim, they died Shmada. Okay, the Gemara doesn't seem to say that. But whatever it is, at that point, Rabbi Akiva could have said, I tried. But no, Rabbi Akiva went and rebuilt Torah. The world, the Gemara in Yevamos says that after the 24,000, V'haya ha'olam shamein, the world was desolate from a spiritual perspective, from a Torah perspective. But Rabbi Akiva felt that no, I can't give up. Rabbi Akiva said, "V'halachta b'drachav," you have to follow in the path of God. The way God acts is the blueprint for the way man should act. God created worlds and destroyed them because the worlds weren't worthy in order for man to know. But then God created a world that he said that he felt was tov, or tov ma'od. It found favor in his eyes. Why did God have to do that as a lesson to man? That we should know that we can't give up. But the message of not giving up is that there is hope and we can do it. Now, how many communities, how many Rabbanim The Panavizharav. He had a yeshiva, he had a community in Europe. And the Nazis destroyed it. There were so many yeshivas that were replanted in Eretz Yisrael, in America. The Torah was rebuilt. And rebuilt by members of the institution that existed in Europe that was destroyed. But they didn't give up. The Talmidim were massacred. The faculties were killed. But they rebuilt, and they were successful in their rebuilding. And this is the lesson. HaKadosh Baruch Hu borel olamos umachrivan. Now, I think that the idea behind Shiva is the same idea. What is Triva? The Rambam in Halakhas Triva, he tells us that we're capable of doing Shiva, that God created man with freedom of will. Because God created man with freedom of will. Because of that, we are able to do tshuva. We're able to change our ways. We shouldn't think that everything is lost. I always mention that the Ramban says the mitzvah shavta Hashem Elokecha, that you should do tshuva, that you're required to do tshuva, as the Ramban says, is also a haftacha b'shavta Hashem Elokecha, that the Jewish people will return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why is it that the Torah uses the exact same words to tell us both messages? It would have been clearer if it had been two separate messages. But we have to know that the mitzvah of the Shavta Hashem Elokecha, the requirement to do tshuva, is based on the recognition of the fact that man can do tshuva, that the Jewish people will eventually do tshuva. That should inspire us to realize that we can do tshuva. We're not allowed to give up hope. That's the idea behind the mitzvah of tshuva. The idea behind the mitzvah of tshuva is don't give up hope. You can do it. And it's very interesting that Chazal tell us, our sages tell us, that Adam mimakom kaparaso nivra. Man was created from the spot where the mizbeach would be built. You would think that it should be in chronological order. You think that it should say that the mizbeach was made from the spot that man was created. No. The Chazal sages wanted to emphasize to us, Adam mimakom kaparaso nivra, man was created in such a way that he should be able to do Shiva. And what is Shiva and what is sinning? And this also is the idea behind what Rabbi Vo's statement. Rabbi Vo said that the idea of Kadosh Baruch Hu borei olamos umachrivan is come to tell us that even though it didn't work the first time, don't give up hope. Do it again. So but what is, when one sins, to a certain degree, at least in his own mind. In a sense, he is chasing God away. He is separating, as the Rambam says, I quoted the Rambam last week, he's separating himself from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Each person is like an olamos, he's his own world. And to a certain degree, as he sins, at least in his own mind, he is pushing God out of that keli, out of that utensil. So we have to understand, the mitzvah of Triva comes and tells us, no, God is not pushed out of that utensil. It's just that we have to make ourselves feel his presence. And there's a very interesting Gemara in Rosh Hashana. The Gemara in Rosh Hashana mentions an opinion that you cannot use the horn of a parah, of a cow, for a chauffeur. Why? Because a prosecutor cannot be a defense attorney. The halacha is, this is one of the reasons given, the halacha is that the Kohen Gadol, on Yom HaKippurim, when he went into the Holy of Holies, so he could not wear his big zav. He could not wear his golden clothes. Why couldn't he wear his golden clothes? Because when he walked into the Kodesh Kodashim, when he walked into the Holy of Holies, so when he walked into the Holy of Holies, so the big day, it was a reminder. In a sense, the Holy of Holies was probably the spot on earth where one was most capable of senses the presence of the Shekhinah, the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the presence of God. So when he walked in a sense, that would be a reminder of the Egel Hazav, of the golden calf that the Jewish people built in the desert near Mount Sinai, when Moshe Rabbeinu was on top of Mount Sinai. Because of this, the Kohen Gadol cannot go into the Holy of Holies with golden clothes. And the Gemara says that perhaps this is the reason why you cannot use a chauffeur of a parah, of a cow. It was an egel, it was a baby cow. And that will be a reminder when we blow that shofar to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So we will be reminding God of the sin of the parah. So then the Gemara asks a question. The Gemara asks a question, but that wasn't the Kodesh Kodashim. In the Holy of Holies, the Kohen Gadol could not go in with golden clothes. It seems the whole issue of a prosecutor not being cannot be a defense attorney is only in the Kodesh Kodashim. In the rest of the Beis HaMikdash, in the rest of the temple, the Kohen Gadol always wore the golden clothes. So why is it that shofar was not blown in the Holy of Holies? So why should we not be able to blow the shofar from a parah, from a cow? And the Gemara says that the shofar is like l'fnai u'l'fnim. The blowing of the shofar is like being inside the Holy of Holies. The question arises, how is it possible that the blowing of the shofar should be like being inside the Holy of Holies? What is the relationship How are we to understand it in every shul? Today there's COVID, many people, and perhaps for good reason, depending on the situation. Depends who davens in the shul and what precautions are taken in the shul, and the concerns that the shul has about safety. Because of that, unfortunately, many people, because their situations in their shuls are not up to par, so many people are scared to go to shul. So where do they hear chauffeur? You have people that come and sometimes stand at the corner of streets, and the neighbors come out and they blow the chauffeur for them. And somehow, according to the Gemara, this is like being ufnai ufnim, like being inside the Holy of Holies. How are we to understand such an idea? The Gemara says that, but my uncle explained it. I have a different explanation. I'll mention it later. But he says the Rambam in Hilchos Triva, the Rambam my uncle was of the opinion, with certain limitations, depending when, that the sound of the chauffeur can be like the sound of a tefillah. You can say it's the cries. Some people pray to God, asking for help, and the sound of the chauffeur is the sound of the cries to God. It's very interesting. We blow 100 kolos, and the truth of the matter is, halakhically, in shul, we only need 60 kolos. Okay, but the question is, why do we blow 100 kolos? 100 sounds? Why 100 sounds? And Yerushalmi says, very strange thing, it says it corresponds with the cries of the Aim Sisra, the mother of Sisra. Sisra was the general who tried to annihilate the Jewish people. And of course, Sisra was killed. And when the mother realized that Sisra wasn't coming back, so the Yerushalmi says she cried 100 times. And corresponding with 100 times that the Aim Sisra cried, we blow 100 sounds of the shofar in Rosh Hashana. How can we understand that? That doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. To blow the sound 100 times because the mother of the biggest anti-Semite of their time, who herself, I'm sure, was an anti-Semite, who was looking forward for her son to return victorious after destroying the Jewish people, cried 100 times. How are we to understand it? But I think very often, when Israel goes in to retaliate or against terrorists, that the Palestinians refuse to stop, in spite of their commitment at the Camp David Accords to do it. Israel goes in to defend itself. And unfortunately, sometimes a civilian is killed. And sometimes it's not a civilian. It's a soldier and a terrorist that was killed. In the front pages of the newspapers, you will see a picture of an Arab mother crying, and people around her consoling her. But when the Jewish child is killed, when a terrorist puts a bomb where there are carriages, or when they go into kindergartens, as they did years ago, nurseries, or they take a Jewish child and they bang his head against the walls of a cave. The mothers of these children also cry, but their picture is not on the front page. No one is interested in the cries of the Jewish mother. No one was interested in the cries of the Jewish mothers during World War II. But at that, and unfortunately today, we have many people who are Jewish, who are unfortunately, because minhag ha-Yehudim is keminhag ha-Goyim asher b'socham hen yoshvim, that have adopted this anti-Semitic approach in the name of Judaism. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says 100 times, the Aim Sisra, the mother of Sisra, and all his successors, all those anti-Semites, the terrorists, there are people that listen to their cries. But no one listens to the cries of the Jewish mother. But the cry of the chauffeur, as the Gemara tells us, is the sounds of the chauffeur are the sounds of crying. Yulule Yoel, Nuche Gonech, cry to me. That's why we blow 100 kolas keneged Aim Sisra. We too, the New York Times doesn't listen to us. The public doesn't listen to us. The United Nations doesn't listen to us. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu does listen to us. And the 100 sounds of the chauffeur are the 100 cries of the Aim Sisra, but there are Jewish mothers also. The world just doesn't want to listen to their cries, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu listens to their cries. And my uncle, he suggested that the cries, and this fits in very well with what I just said, although my uncle did not say this pshat. My uncle said that the sounds of the chauffeur have to be made in a way that they could serve as a tefillah, as a prayer. As a prayer. So there are many halakhas regarding Kia chauffeur, the blowing of the chauffeur, that are similar to the sounds of that are similar to the halakhas of tefillah, of davening, of praying. And the Rambam says in Hilchos Tefillah that when one prays, one should pray as if he's standing in front of God. Chaim very much emphasizes that point. And he says also, as if you're standing in heaven in front of God. So the Rambam says that the mitzvah of davening requires a Jew to, in a sense, to act as if he was in heaven itself and standing in front of God in heaven. And he says, in a sense, so the chauffeur too, the blowing of the chauffeur should be done in a way, it's not ma'akev, but should be done in a way as if you're standing in heaven in front of God. And the Kodesh Kodashim, the Holy of Holies, that's like heaven down on earth. My uncle didn't phrase it that way. It's like heaven down on earth. So therefore, when we blow the shofar, it's like entering the Kodesh Kodashim. And since it's like entering the Kodesh Kodashim, just as a Kohen Gadol is not supposed to wear the golden clothes when he walks into the Kodesh Kodashim, into the Holy of Holies, so too, the Kohen Gadol, the person blowing the chauffeur should not use a chauffeur shopara, because the chauffeur has to be of such nature that it could serve as a tefillah. And as a tefillah means it has to be able to be used as a tefillah. And if it's a prosecutor, tefillah is a defense attorney. And if it serves as a prosecutor, it could not be a defense attorney. This is how my uncle explained it. Now, to be honest, there is a question that we could raise against that. Because the mitzvah, the question is, who is the target? When we're blowing the shofar, who are we blowing the shofar to? Who are we giving the message of the shofar to? According to my uncle, it's a tefillah. So in a sense, we're blowing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's an act of crying, perhaps, but we're expressing in a different sort of way some kind of message to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And a matter of fact, we find similar medrashim. The medrash says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, blow the shofar before me, and I will remember in your merit, for your merit, the schus, the merit of the Akedas Yitzchak, of Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac on the altar. So this medrash is explicit that we're blowing to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're trying to remind HaKadosh Baruch Hu figuratively. We are talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're begging God. On the other hand, when we make the bracha, we say the bracha is lishmoa kol shofar, to hear the sound of the shofar. That indicates that we're blowing the shofar. We're blowing the shofar for ourselves, that we should hear it. It's not aimed at HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not a message that we're giving God. It's a message we're giving ourselves, as the Rambam says, Uri yishenu mikirmaschem, awake from your spiritual lethargy. How are we to put these two things together? But the answer is that we have to listen to the message that we're telling HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Very often we tell HaKadosh Baruch Hu things, and we ask for things, and we remind HaKadosh Baruch Hu about things, and we remind HaKadosh Baruch Hu about the covenant. But we don't focus on it ourselves. We have to listen to what we're telling God, because the message we give to God is a message for us as well. When we remind HaKadosh Baruch Hu about the Akedah, it's not only God. We have to remember that we are reminding God about the Akedah. We have to listen to that message of the Akedah as well. That's part of the mitzvah of shofar. So that way we can understand how the sounds of the shofar could serve as a tefillah. Now, however, I wanted to explain the Gemara a little different than my uncle. And it's based on an idea that I've expressed numerous times lately. I've said, what is the idea behind shofar? The idea behind shofar, because at the time of Matan Torah, God made his presence known to the Jewish people, the kol chauffeur hafata. The experience of Matan Torah, besides the receiving of the Torah, was the experience of sensing the presence of God, revelation. And the Beis Hamikdash, I mentioned the Ramban many times. The Beis Hamikdash is the perpetuation of Har Sinai. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu made his presence known to the Jewish people from above Har Sinai. In a sense, the kol chauffeur figuratively came from above Har Sinai. And the Beis Hamikdash, the Kodesh Kodashim, is probably analogous to that area where Moshe Rabbeinu went up to have his meeting with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to bring the luchos down. So for the kol chauffeur, and why is there a mitzvah of chauffeur? Because what was the mistake that the Jewish people made? When Moshe Rabbeinu was no longer there, they were not able to perpetuate that experience of sensing the presence of God. The mitzvah of chauffeur reminds us how we have to perpetuate that experience. So in a sense, it's re-experiencing. Chauffeur is re-experiencing. The sound of the chauffeur came from the top of Har Sinai. So therefore, the blowing of the shofar is reminiscent of going into the Kodesh Kodashim, because the top of Har Sinai corresponds with the Kodesh Kodashim, with the Holy of Holies. Now, we said that the world were destroyed. The previous worlds were destroyed according to Rabbi Akiva, according to Mekubalim, because of Shviras HaKelim. And what caused the breaking of the Kelim? What caused the breaking of the Kelim, of the utensils of the previous worlds, was God removing himself from that world. And when we sin to a certain degree, we are, at least in our minds, pushing God out of our world. And it's very interesting, the Rambam, when he talks about just before he talks in Halakhas Shiva about Yom Kippurim and about Rosh Hashana, so he talks about a community, a nation that is so sinful that when they have a majority of averos, majority of sins, but when we say rov averos, rov sins, it's in accordance with a special accounting which we don't understand. So that world is destroyed. And the Rambam says, because of that, a person should always see himself as if the world is 50-50. And he is 50-50. And the next mitzvah that he does will determine his fate and determine the fate of the world. And the Rambam then emphasizes, but this is even most important during the Aseret Shemei Tshuva, during Rosh Hashana. In other words, the idea is that sin can destroy. There's a bris, there's a haftacha, the world won't be destroyed. But there are smaller worlds that can be destroyed. And it's our tshuva, in a sense, that prevents God from being removed from these worlds. Now, it's very interesting. There is a Maharal. Maharal is a near mitzvah, it's about Hanukkah. The Maharal in near Hanukkah says that it mentions the Gemara, the Medrash, that one of the words xeros, one of the decrees that the Greeks made was kispu al keren shore, right on the horn of a shore of an ox. Ein lanu chelik b'elokei Yisrael. We have no portion in the God of Israel. Now, the simple meaning of the Gemara is because shore in those days was something that was an agricultural society. And almost everybody needed a shore. So if you wouldn't write it, you had no economic ability because you couldn't have a shore. You couldn't have an ox. But the Maharal interprets it in a drush, mystical form. And he says, Kisfu al keren shor ein lo nuchelik olokei Yisrael. The Greeks tried to give the Jewish people the impression they have no hope with God, that with the golden calf, they lost all their merits with their God. And when they lose faith and they lose hope, they tried to make them believe that there was no hope left for them. And this is what the mitzvah of tshuva is. The mitzvah of tshuva is, yes, things didn't work out the way we planned originally, but we don't give up hope. We have to do it again. And this is the idea, and we can do it again. And we can act properly. I once saw a letter from Rav Hutner. I think it was a letter to a Talmud. It was printed. No one showed it to me, a personal letter, but it was a printed letter. And Rav Hutner talked about the Gdolim that focused on particular areas of halacha, concerned about particular areas. I remember one of those that he mentioned was the Chavetz Chaim. And he mentioned that the Chavetz Chaim said that the Chavetz Chaim focused on Shmiras Halashon, on watching about gossip, talking negatively about others. Everybody knew that was a special focus that the Chavetz Chaim had. And Rav Hutner said, do you think the Chavetz Chaim himself did not initially have struggle? I would not make such a statement. But in this letter, it was sort of shocking to me. He says, you think the Chavetz Chaim didn't have a struggle? And he says, it's possible. And I would, again, never have made such a statement. That perhaps when he was younger, maybe he did something that he thought he shouldn't have done in that respect. He says, but he didn't give up. And all the Golan, they struggled. It didn't happen so easy. I know my uncle mentions that Reb Chaim told my grandfather. Now, Reb Chaim was known, of course, Reb Chaim was known for his genius, his learning, his depth, his clarity of understanding. But Reb Chaim excelled in the area of chesed, in kindness, in sensitivity to others. There was no one like Reb Chaim. Bali Musar said that they would go to Reb Chaim not just to see his learning, but to see his chesed, to learn from what he did, not from what he said, in terms of chesed, with the way he acted. And according to what my uncle said, Reb Chaim told my grandfather Don't think that when I help somebody out, this is something that came naturally to me. He says, I wasn't that way, but I worked on myself. But he was able to work on himself. And this is the idea. The idea is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, at the time of creation of man, he gave man the ability to achieve and to accomplish. And even if we mess up, it doesn't mean we lost hope. We can still do it again. And we could do it, and we could be successful in doing it. And this is the message of Rosh Hashana. The message of Rosh Hashana is that Adam mimakom kaparaso nivra. Man was created from the place of his kapara, from the place of his atonement. That means it's not that the first time you sin, the second time you sin, the third time you sin, the fourth time you sin, the Rambam discusses 3-4 times, that it's all lost. No, there's always hope, even to the very last breath a person has. Of course, you should not wait for that. There is always hope. And that's Mikveh Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is, on one hand, he's the one that we have faith in. And he's the mikveh. We purify ourselves in being close to him. And Rosh Hashanah is dedicated to the chauffeur. The chauffeur is the idea of we perpetuate God's existence that gives us the ability in our small worlds to sense the presence of God. God created our world just as he created the greater world with the ability to perpetuate his presence there. And that's through the mitzvah of Shiva. And that's why the Rosh Hashana as a Yom Shiva, as a day of Shiva, falls out on the falls as the same day as the creation of man, because then that was when we were given that ability to do Shiva. Okay.
Okay, so please put questions in the chat. From what you said at the beginning about your uncle's answer that Hashem needed to be Boneh, olamos, umachrivan for us to learn from that. Is that similar to some of the Rishonim who say Ma'isa Avos Siman Labanim? Certain things had to happen to the Avos so we can learn from that.
But I don't want to compare anybody to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but there is some similarity.
But the fact that we needed something done to be a lesson or a blueprint. Right. Someone asked, what is the mahus of the kalim, which I guess were the earlier olamos to bring the Shechina into the world?
I'm afraid you'll have to ask him a question.
Okay. Someone asked if Rabbi could repeat the part of what the Maharal said about the decree of the Greeks, about Kiswa Karen Shor. What did the Maharal say? The
Maharal said that in other words, because the shore represented the Degel Hazav, and so you should write on the shore, right on the shore. Ein lanu chelik elokei Yisrael. We don't have a portion in the God of Israel. In other words, we should feel that we already lost our connection to God. In the same way as some try to say that God cut himself off from the Jewish people. It's not something old. It's something that repeats itself from time to time.
This isn't a question on you, but it seems that the publisher should follow Rav Hutner's letter about the Gedolim a little bit more. Instead of saying how the Gedolim, were, knew all the shots by the time they were 4 years old and stuff, and were perfect. It just...
What can I tell you?
I guess in that though, was the Maritz?
I want to tell you. I'll tell you. After Moshe Feinstein passed away, so they were going around saying that Moshe Feinstein went through Shas 200 times. And that time, Moshe Pendler said that he said if he went through Shas 200 times, he would not have known it as well as he knew it. But he said but at that time I saw an interesting article. It was written by a person that was not necessarily close to Moshe Feinstein. He says when they write that Moshe Feinstein went through Shas 200 times, he says, what can we learn from that? We can learn how great Moshe Feinstein was, but it will not help us at all. But he says when they write how Moshe Feinstein used to go to buy a newspaper for his wife, today they might not put that in the book, go to buy a newspaper for his wife, that is something that we could learn from. Unfortunately, the focus of the stories is stories that we can't learn from, telling us how we cannot improve ourselves because there's no way we're going to reach those levels. But story, instead of focusing on things that we could learn learn the lesson from, so they use an altogether different approach.
I forget right now, was the Maritz the one who said about the Chassid HaMe'ula that the Chassid HaMe'ula is better, or that the
Rabbi Yaakov Emden said the Moshe Barucho is at a higher level. The Balatanya and the Gra, they seem to say that they don't use the word Chassid HaMe'ula. The Balatanya uses the word Tzadik Gomer. That the Tzadik Gomer, which is the equivalent of the Chassid HaMe'ula, that's on a higher level. And the Rambam seems to distinguish between mitzvahs sichlios and mitzvahs that are not sichlios, not rational mitzvahs, but they are mitzvahs of submission. He says mitzvah sichlios, so the Chassid HaMe'ula is bigger, higher level, but on rational mitzvahs, so it's the Moshe Barucho that is. He says the Moshe on the mitzvah sichlios. So there, a person should do it because the Chassid HaMe'ula is better. In the mitzvah sichlios, the Chassid HaMe'ula is better. But in the mitzvahs that are just the creeds, so there it's better the Moshe Barucho.
Okay. Another question: if it's as if we're in the Kodesh HaKodashim during Tekiyas Chauffeur, what should our kavanagh be when we hear the chauffeur?
So our kavanagh should be that first of all, Malchus HaKadosh Baruch Hu, recognizing Malchus HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and recognizing recognizing Malchus HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's everything. And on the other hand, asking God to remember the Bris Avram and all of those type of things, the relationship between God and the Jewish people.
We don't need any big, deep, Kabbalistic, mystical kavanahs, just to fulfill the mitzvah and the idea that we're making Hashem king.
The idea of, I think all of that will be focused just if you have kavanah to be yotzei the mitzvah. If you have kavanah to be yotzei the mitzvah, so you're submitting to the rule of God, and and Melech Olam. There is a question, because the Rambam mentions that in Hilchos Tshuva, Afal Pi, even though it's Exeris Akasav, Remez Yesh B'Davar, there is a message in chauffeur. So the question is, why doesn't the Rambam mention it in Hilchos Chauffeur? Why does he mention it in Hilchos Tshuva? So my uncle felt that part of the mitzvah is to know the message of chauffeur. But for my grandfather, it seems that my grandfather understood that when you do the chauffeur itself, you have to do it because you're doing it because it was a mitzvah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do it. And I am submitting to the mitzvah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave me to do. But when you think about the mitzvah of chauffeur, and that's part of the mitzvah of tshuva, especially during the Aseres Yemei Tshuva, is in a sense to think and to evaluate yourself and to evaluate what you encounter. And when you evaluate the mitzvah of chauffeur, you come inspired by the fact it's a wake-up call. So, but that is not necessarily part of the mitzvah of chauffeur. Otherwise, the Rambam would have mentioned it in Hilchos Chauffeur. Instead, he mentions it in Hilchos Tshuva. So it's more part of the mitzvah of tshuva, thinking about the message of chauffeur, than it is part of the mitzvah of chauffeur itself.
Is it are you allowed to have personal requests while you're listening to the chauffeur?
Definitely. Especially if you say like my uncle, that it's a form of tefillah. So you certainly can have special requests.
It's not like Shabbos that you're not allowed to have personal requests.
Well, if you've been Shabbos, if you keep it in your mind, it's not a big issue. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's the last question that we had. Thank you, Rabbi, for giving us the share. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And Shiva Chesima Tova to everyone.
Yeah. And next Sunday again.
Okay, Mir Tashem, next Sunday, same time, same link.
That's right.